Now, I was just checking on the speaker's handbook before I came in, and the first thing it says, a speaker should never start off by apologising. It sets the wrong tone. So first of all, I'd like to make 2 apologies. The first one is that there is going to be a series of graphs and charts from me at some length. When Professor David Harvey wrote a piece when I debated with him on the nature of the rate of profit and crises, he said, the trouble with Michael Roberts is he starts off with a pile and array of graphs, and we never get down to the nitty-gritty of theory. My reply was, unless we have some empirical evidence of what's going on, we don't know if the theory's right. It's a combination of the two. That's the first apology. The much more important apology is that despite his array of graphs, despite his empirical evidence, he keeps getting it wrong. And those who have been to this meeting for the last few years at various venues will have heard me say, and next year we will enter a new global recession to end the current period of expansion we've had from 2009. And in my book, The Long Depression, I suggest that we're in a down wave in this depression, which would end around about 2018 at the latest. And here we are in the summer of 2019, and still there is no recession on a global scale. Indeed, Donald Trump this morning tweeted that as soon as the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, America will be like a rocket ship, taking off into the stratosphere in growth and incomes for all Americans, not for anybody else, mind you. This seems to be a position we're in. And last week, the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, which is a US research organization, which looks at booms and slumps and measures them. It defines a recession as 2 quarters consecutively that have a drop in national output, or production of things and services in 2 quarters consecutively fall. That is defined as a recession. And there have been a lot of recessions in capitalism in the post-war period, and even further back to the NBR goes back to 1855, looking at those recessions. But since the end of what we call the Great Recession in June 2009, in the United States at least, we have not had 2 consecutive quarterly falls in GDP or national income. So there has been a continuous expansion. Indeed, last week it was announced this is the longest post-war expansion, expansion since the post-war period, since 1945. Thus, Michael Roberts, small as he is, has been beautifully contradicted. However, if we look at the figures, which we will do at some length, it may be the longest expansion, but it is the weakest expansion that capitalism, not just in the US, but also across the major economies, have had since the Second World War and since the 1930s. The average growth rate in the US since 2009 for the last 10 years has been just under 2.5% in real GDP terms. In Europe, it's been under 2%, and in Japan, about 1.5%. That's approximately 50% below the usual average trend growth rate when there's a boom period in the post-war period. This has been a very weak one. And if you do it per capita, that means if I take the total amount of output and divide it by the number of people in a country to get the actual output per person, then the growth rate has been even lower, much lower than that. A country like the UK has had a growth rate just over 2% since 2009 each year until the last year or so, and we'll see about next year. But if you take it per capita, the UK growth rate is very low because we've had quite a sharp increase in population of people coming into the UK to work and add to total GDP. So per capita rates have been very low indeed. So before I come to the prediction for 2020, let's analyse a little bit about what's going on. And you'll see the title of my piece of paper today, or presentation today, is the Trade and Technology Trigger. And since last year, we have had a significant change in the balance of economic relations around the world. We now have a trade war taking place between the United States under Trump and China, the other major trading power in the world, manufacturing power in the world. And it's not just about trade, it's also about new technology and the control of that new technology in world production and in world trade. And this is significantly transforming the picture and making it much more difficult for the world economy to continue to grow. So what we have now is a figure by JP Morgan, the investment bank. Global PMI, what the heck is that? Global PMI is Purchasing Managers Index output. I still know the wiser. What it means is it's a measure of business activity in different countries, and it's measured by asking a load of people in companies, is your company doing better this month or worse this month? And they add them all up and they come up with a survey figure of whether there's more thinking it's better or more thinking it's less. And if it's 50, there's more thinking it's better, and if it's under 50, there's more thinking it's worse. So this is JP Morgan's added up every single PMI survey in every country, collected it all together to give you a world figure. Only they do this, and you have to pay for it, by the way, but you're getting it free. You can see that manufacturing has virtually gone down to zero. So on a survey basis, the companies around the world that have been surveyed think that things are getting worse and they're no longer getting better on a monthly basis, and that's going to go below that 50 line. Services, which is obviously what's not manufacturing, is still higher, so there's still growth in the services sectors around the major economies in the world at the moment, but it's coming down. One other thing about the graph. Do you notice how it nearly came down to zero in 2016 and so on? We had almost a mini recession then when I was predicting the recession. And after that, we got the opposite. So you can see that there's a sort of cycle, short-term cycle here, which we economists or mainstream economists call the kitchen cycle, which is based on a sort of 4-year swing from trough to trough. And it seems that we're heading now into a new trough position in the world economy. But this is the big change too, a very sharp drop in trade. Global trade growth has taken a big hit in the last 6 months, but even before that. How can we see that? Well, if we look at the red line, that tells you the growth in trade at any one point compared to the previous year. So it reached, at the beginning of 2018, nearly a 5% growth rate, the red line, and now it's dropped down to zero as we go into 2019. If you want to do it on a bit more short-term basis, every 3 months change, you can see that we're now going into negative territory on the trade. So world trade is now basically negative, or flat at best. So that the ability of any country that's got a problem with growth or with trying to maintain production and investment, it can't rely on selling abroad because trade growth is declining. Why is it declining? Because this new battle between Trump and China over trade regulations, subsidies, and technology. This is producing an impact upon investment, which, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the most important things to look at. Are capitalists investing? Are they investing in new productive capacity to take economies forward, or are they not? Again, rather a complicated graph, but basically look at the orange line. That's the actual growth in global capital investment, according to JP Morgan, free to you, is coming the same sort of cycle there, where it actually went negative in 2016, and investment now is virtually down to around about 2% a year, which is really quite a low level for the growth in capital investment. The nowcast, the blue line, is a forecast of where it's going to go. It's going to go negative, according to JP Morgan. So we've got negative world trade. We're now going to have negative investment, and we've already seen that capitalist companies think that things are going to get worse, not better, on a whole. So there's only one area which has been doing hugely well in this environment, and that is the US tech giants. That's what is shorthand called FANGs, which is Facebook, Amazon, Alphabet, Netflix, Google. Have I missed anybody? Microsoft comes on the end because it doesn't fit into FANGs, so you stick it on. And these tech giants are the ones that have made all the huge profits in the US. And if you strip out the profits that the tech giants make, so the blue line on the left-hand side is the tech giants' profits, and the black line is, if you take them out, that's for the rest of the capitalist economies' profits, around capitalist companies' profits around the world. So you can see there is a significant gap. If for any reason something goes wrong with the top tech giants' profits in the US, then profits as a whole are going to make a serious dive in the next few years if the gap between the blue line and the black line on the left-hand side was to narrow, and to narrow because the blue line falls. The right-hand side simply shows that the US is a lot better than Europe. So here is an estimate of what this new trade war, these tariff tit-for-tats that's going on. Even on the existing trade tariffs that have been introduced, we just had a G20 meeting, and President Trump and President Xi had a little discussion over a burger and agreed not to increase tariffs anymore for the moment. 2 days later, the Chinese said, unless all tariffs that the Americans have introduced are removed, we will not agree to anything further at all, and we'll have to continue with our tariff increases. So the battle could resume, and I'm sure it will. But you can see the cumulative cost of this trade war in hitting GDP for the US, China, and the rest of the world brought together, in the next 2 years will go to 1.2 trillion, which is approximately 1.5% of GDP. So it's a cumulative effect, but if growth rates in the world, which is estimated currently between 2.5% and 3%, if you're going to take 1.5% off over 2 years, you're going to knock that rate down by 30 or 40%, which is significant when you're only growing at this small level. Now, my book's called The Long Depression, but I just wanted to compare to see who has been depressed over the last period. This unprecedented expansion, longest expansion in capitalism since 1945, doesn't seem to have benefited most of us. The red line is labour productivity. Real compensation is the blue line, per hour's work. So that's how much, on average, workers have got after inflation each year during this period. If you look from the period from 2009 to now, basically, real wages have grown by a little bit more than 0.5% a year on average, while output has been growing at 2 to 3%, and productivity is also declined quite sharply. So the only reason output has increased is because there's more people at work. And I think, what does that mean in practice? It means we have supposedly near full employment in the UK. We supposedly have near full employment, record employment, lowest unemployment rates in the US, in Japan, and other countries. But do we have better standards of living? What's happened is that most of the people who have been coming into work have been taking really low-wage jobs, precarious jobs, not organised jobs, not high-skilled jobs that pay well. Only in the tech FANGs are people paid well. Everybody else is working in service sector jobs, which have very low levels of wages, or in public sector jobs, health, education, and so on, also with low wages. And in many cases in the private sector, with no guarantee of even 1 year's work. And of course, we know in the case of the UK, we have anything between 1 to 2 million people on 0 hours contracts. So they're qualified as being employed. The definition in the US is, if you work for 1 hour a week, you're fully employed. So the employment figure is a little bit misleading when it comes to the incomes that people are getting. Now, here is the array of graphs that Professor David Harvey doesn't like. this want to underline underneath what's going on in the world economy, going way back, to tell you that capitalism is continually moving into crises on a regular basis. And the reason for that is that capitalism, despite being a system and a mode of production designed to increase profits, aiming to get more and more profits, it comes into conflict with that very objective, and that profitability begins to fall at certain periods over time, and this creates the conditions for a crisis. We've had several ones which have been severely leading to a long depression. These are figures from the Bank of England, which I've computed along with my famous friend Esteban Maito. Those who have been before will know that the Argentine scholar who works in the dungeons of the Argentine Finance Department in the dark and sometimes allowed out, spends his evenings preparing data like this. And we see a very long period of the rate of profit globally, and we can see that generally over the last 150 years or so, the rate of profit has been falling on a secular basis, but not on a straight line. Otherwise, the world would have come to an end under capitalism. There have been periods of recovery, partly through a long depression, partly mainly often through war, and the period immediately after the Second World War, called the Golden Age up there, is the period when, of course, I was a young teenager and revolutionary, didn't worry about jobs, could always get a job, full employment everywhere, education free, health service good, public services good. It was a golden age. But actually, in the history of capitalism, that golden age of approximately 15, 20 years is an exception. This is the point that perhaps has to be grasped. It was an exceptional period. I was very lucky to be virile at that time. Now, when I'm ancient, I'm down in this depression, down the bottom right-hand corner, along with the rest of you, depressed. And the huge profitability crisis that took place after the Golden Age was then led to the collapse of manufacturing in lots of the major economies in the world, a new change on the part of the capitalists in policy. They're no longer prepared to make concessions to the workers. They couldn't afford to. They had to revert to the more normal policy, which is to keep workers, organizations, and struggle to the barest minimum, to drive it down and not make any concessions, and above all, to reduce the size of public services and other things which cost them in tax. So public services have to be crushed, any state sectors have to be privatized, unions have to be destroyed and their rights destroyed in order to drive up the level of profit they can get out of workers and therefore move profitability upwards and restore the ability of capitalism to have another period of success and health. Well, this is a so-called neoliberal recovery. This is a phrase that academic economists on the left use, or the neoliberal. Well, I'm not quite sure what it means. Basically, it means that this is capitalist policy in action in order to drive up profitability. And how successful has that been? Well, from 1983 to the end of the 20th century, there's been a rise in the rate of profit, but it's all that squeeze and misery descending on the working class. That's what the capitalists as a whole, on average, have managed to achieve. They're still in some difficulty. And then that's really come to an end. With the Great Recession too, we see a fall in the profitability, a new depressive period. This is a difficult period for capitalism, and therefore also a difficult period for us as workers in this environment. There is no way capitalism is going back to the Golden Age. No way. What's going to happen is a series of slumps and crises to try and drive up that profitability that we see at the moment. That's why I have correctly predicted another slump. And you can see if profitability goes down, what goes down with it? The growth in fixed productive investment. What matters? Productive investment, new factories, new industries, new technology, new jobs that flow from proper investment by the capitalists to develop the economy and take the productive forces forward. If you want an indication of how much effort is being made by the capitalists to take the productive forces forward, you can see that it is declining on a long-term basis since the 70s and the profitability crisis. Investment per GDP, as a share of GDP, and this is in the developed markets, has been falling. After the Great Recession in 2009, there's been a recovery, but it's only been not to restore to the levels we saw in the Golden Age, which are before this graph altogether. So with profitability falling, so does investment. And on the left-hand side, we can see that that means if there's low investment or slowing investment, then the productivity that they can get out of workers, taking the productive forces forward, is also slowing. And in fact, in the case of the advanced countries, these are the latest figures actually from the IMF, it's negative. Labour productivity growth on average is falling now, not even growing, slowly. And on the right side, we can see that the Asian industrial economies are still getting a reasonable rate of productivity, around 3%, but that includes China. Take China out, it's a different story. And you can see in Latin America, it's virtually down to zero. So falling profitability, slowing investment, slowing even negative productivity, world trade now in decline. I don't know, I might be getting there. And of course, what are they, if they're not investing in productive assets, what are the capitalists doing? If their profitability in productive assets is so low, what they've done is to go into the speculation in the financial sector to try and counteract the low profitability in the productive sector, so the banks will be much more, don't want to lend to companies that don't make much profit, and companies that have a lot of cash don't want to reinvest. They look to speculate in the financial sector, in bonds, stocks and shares, and build up their financial assets. This drives up the value of those financial assets, and if it drives up the value of those financial assets, they can get profit out of that, and they can also claim to continue to grow. That is what Trump talks about when he says, I want the Federal Reserve Bank to cut interest rates, and then everything will shoot up. What he means is the stock market will shoot up, but not the real economy as such. It hasn't done so during this past period, as we've seen from the beginning of 2018. But the share of financial sector profits in the US reached a massive, well, it's just staggering for one quarter at 70%, just before the Great Recession and the credit squeeze, and it's still a significant part of total US corporate profits as a key. And you can see if you go back to the post-war period, it was really only around about 10 to 15%, and now it's averaging between 30 or 40%. So most capitalistic companies in the US depend on making money out of financial speculation rather than actually doing anything useful. But that means that they have to build up a lot of debt because they're buying debt and they're creating debt. If you look at the orange line, which has got a right-hand scale, that's business debt, credit to GDP in the US. It's gone from the 1980s at around about 50% of GDP to nearly 75% of GDP currently. So there's a huge rise in company debt, corporate debt, which is building up, alongside all the other factors that I've described before. Luckily, because interest rates are so low, the cost of servicing that debt is relatively low. And that's why there hasn't been any crises in any big capitalist companies since 2009 for the moment. And that's what Trump is also concerned about, to keep the interest rate down. What the heck is Q ratio? Well, Q ratio is the measure between the stock market price of a company and the actual value of the company as measured by the accountants in its assets and its profits capitalized. So if the stock market price is equal to the capitalized assets of a company, which is actually, if you had to sell it just without the stock market, sell the company, then it should be on the range of around about 100. Actually, it's usually on average below that. Companies don't sell for their full value when they have to be sold quickly. But what it tells you is that the stock market price for most companies in America, on average, is way, way, way higher than they're actually worth when you actually sell their assets. So it's a fictitious form of capital. So somebody says that Facebook is worth $100 share price. In reality, if you tried to sell Facebook's assets its staff and everything else to somebody else, they'd be lucky to get $60 for it. But the stock market has driven it up way higher than that. So there's a danger for people who want to buy all these stocks, like banks and others, that they're buying what is fictitious capital. If it's actually had to realize that in the sale, then they wouldn't get that money. So we can see the Q ratio reached in 2007 1.1 compared to the average of about 70. It was more than double the fictitious capital level. Then it came down in the slump, and now it's crawled back up again. So there's a huge build-up of fictitious capital, which will accelerate or will expand any recession into a major financial crisis. Now, a lot of people tell me, well, FANGs are making huge amounts of money. This is true. They've got lots of cash. They can borrow lots of cash. They've been keeping it abroad in the US. And then Trump said, don't keep it abroad. We won't tax you. So they brought it back. So they brought it in one offer, but then they build it up again in their offshore accounts. As we know, approximately 7% of world GDP is held in offshore havens. So these companies are hiding their money from any taxes they have. And anybody know what the biggest offshore tax haven in the world is? Which one? Nope. Ireland. Good old Ireland. They know how to build an economy. You send your money to an Irish bank, they'll salt it away for you, don't you worry. And you can and if you're a big company, your transfer pricing will be accepted so you can avoid the levels of tax that you might have to do wherever you're based. So Ireland, according to Daniel Zucman, the friend of Thomas Piketty, the inequality expert, is the offshore tax haven to go for. And so we can see a large increase in cash being held, debt being raised on that at cheap rates, and the big companies making a lot of money while still appearing to have a lot of debt. That explains that. But the vast majority of companies don't earn that sort of money and don't have that sort of cash hoard and can't raise that sort of debt at those interest rates. And also there's a significant minority of companies called zombie firms who don't earn enough property even to cover the interest on the debt that they've already issued. Now these companies have borrowed also quite often debt which would never be bought by anybody else, and so they'd be in real trouble if there's a call on the money that they have borrowed, and if interest rates go up, and if profits for them fall even further. How many of these are these zombie companies around the world? Well, according to the Bank of International Settlements, it's something anywhere between 8% of companies in the world are zombie companies. They don't earn enough money to even pay their existing debts, so they're just crawling along because the banks haven't foreclosed on them. And there could be more of these if there's a fall in profit and interest rates rise. So these are the weak parts of the capitalist sector. And as one famous Marxist said, capitalist crises start at the weakest link. And that's what you have to look at. Now, there are areas of the world which haven't been collapsing. The elephant and the dragon, India and China. And if we look at this graph, you can see that the top blue line tells you the growth per person per year in the top 30 emerging economies. That's excluding the advanced countries and including China and India. They've been growing at nearly 4% a year, sometimes more. But if you take China out, you have the red line, still keeping India in, and you can see that then the growth rate is more like 2%. So China makes a big difference to this statistical calculation. And then if you just look at the developed markets, which is the advanced economies like we've got, we are in, it's under 2%. So what that tells you is that China has been the most powerful growth economy in the last 30 years and continues to be so. This is a startlingly different situation that's never been seen actually in capitalism or in human development before, a growth rate of between 6 and 10% a year for 1.5 billion people, not Hong Kong and Singapore, little city-states, a huge economy which has been growing at this rate. So what happens in China is very important to the world economy. And China is slowing. Its investment has been slowing. Its manufacturing has been slowing. Its trade has been slowing. Why? Because there's now a trade and technology war with the US that's underway, and it's having its impact upon China's growth rates and the ability of China to continue to take hundreds of millions of people out of the official definition of poverty that we've seen over the last 30 years. So if China's important to the world economy and it's being squeezed by this trade and technology war, it's not going to be the economy that saves capitalism if the rest of it's in trouble. And now we come to another of my favourite graphs, one particularly David Harvey doesn't like, because he says, he wrote, I'm being nasty to David, he's a friend of mine. He wrote it in one piece, he said, you know, corporate profits are up globally because I read it in the business press. Well, I thought, yeah, okay, yeah, that's true. The FANGs are making this profit and so on. But I think we economists like to take all the data together and try to see the whole picture. And so here is a measure of the global profit rates, the global profit growth in the major 5 economies in the world, and aggregated together and weighted. We can see there are quite periods when growth rates in corporate profits in the companies were 30 or 40% back in 2000 in the tech boom, then a crash, and they still went along at 20% during the 2000s period, pretty good. Then we have the Great Recession of 2008-9, was hugely negative, recovery from that. But since then, in this weak period, this long depression, this weak period, the growth in corporate profits in the major economies has been staggering along under 10% on most quarters. And in particular, in this very recent period, it's now back into negative territory. Indeed, if you take it from the middle of 2016 to now, and take out that quick lump, which is mainly due to Mr. Trump announcing you don't have to pay any more taxes, that you can see corporate profits have really just stagnated. And in my view, if capitalism is a system for production for profit, for investment for profit, if profits aren't growing, then investment won't grow, and the danger is that there will be a turn down in the whole economy. Will there be a recession? Well, here we go again. There's going to be a recession. And when will it be? Well, as I said in previous years, I've said it's not just good enough to predict a recession. The recession's going to happen. Well, yeah, I know, but the clock comes around to midnight, doesn't it? So we know it's going to go to midnight, so that doesn't really tell us too much. It's when is there going to be a recession and how deep it is. And so I bravely attempt to predict when there's going to be one and how deep it is. And so far I've been fantastically accurate. But here is an indicator which has got a great degree of reliability on causing a recession. The little grey columns stuck in there are the periods of recession. And you'll notice that the line says just before the recession starts, this line goes below into negative territory. What is this line? Well, this, as you all know, being experts, is the inverted yield curve. Yes, exactly. So what is the inverted yield curve? Well, it is a measure of the interest rate for, if I borrow some money, if I'm a company or a government, and I borrow some money for 10 years, it's called a 10-year bond, and it has an interest rate on it. If I borrow some money for 3 months, it has a different interest rate on it. Now, usually, the interest rate for borrowing on 10 years is way higher than the interest rate for borrowing on 3 months, because I'm giving the person who's lending this money to is giving it for 10 years. Who knows what might happen in 10 years? You've got to pay me a lot more interest. If I'm only lending it for 3 months, then obviously you can have it at a lower interest rate, and because I'm going to get my money back in 3 months. So generally, the yield curve is higher, it's steeper because the 10-year one's up here and the 3-month one is down there. But now, and you can see, then that's usually the case, but suddenly, whenever it drops below that, so when we get to the point where the 10-year interest rate is lower than the 3-month interest rate, there seems to be, if it stays down there, on nearly every occasion in the post-war period, a slump follows. Why is that? It's because those who are lending the money, and those who are borrowing the money are now really worried something's about to go wrong, and therefore they're not really willing to even lend at 3-month rates that are very low. And in the case of the big long bond, people want to hold that bond. They've bought it, they want to hold it because it's the safest thing in the world if it's the US. But if they want to buy lots of it, and they don't want to buy stocks and shares, and they don't want to invest in the economy, they just want to hold a bond. You think of it this way: you've got, say, £100 in the bank. Now you could give it to your friend, who is now going to invest it in a nice risky enterprise of buying Bitcoin around the corner. And you think, well, that's one possibility. It's a bit risky. Or he says, no, I'm just going to go down the road and bet on this horse at the 3 p.m. Raise. What do you think about that £100? I tell you what, I don't want to do that. What I'll do is I'll take your £100 and just keep it here in the bank, and you can take it back any time you like. Oh, okay then. So what you're getting is people holding on to things which they feel really safe about, but they're having to pay more of them because they're safe. We have now the position that if you want to buy a 10-year bond, a government bond, because governments are very safe, you don't get interest rate on it at all. So when you buy a bond, you're basically lending money to a government. But in this situation, it's now the case that in about 40% of government bonds around the world, you're actually paying to get the bond because it's such a safe thing and nobody wants to do anything else. And that's what the indicator here, the recession indicator, is showing, that we could be heading into a new recession. Here's a measure by the New York Fed of the probability of a recession. Right up to date, you can see that 12 months ahead, it's now a 20% chance. Just before the Great Recession, it was 45%. And in the little recession of 2001, they didn't even notice till it happened. It was all over before they actually realized there was a recession. But in the 2009 one, just before it happened, there was a 40% probability according to the New York Fed. So we don't have to wait for 50 or 60 on this sort of measure. 20 is telling you something as well. Finally, Chair, a few challenges for the future. Because I don't want to talk about booms and slumps. You have to talk about the world economy longer term as well. And what are the features of the last 10 years of fantastic expansion that we've been told about by The Economist and others? First of all, a huge increase in the inequality of wealth around the world, within the major economies in particular. On the left-hand side, in 1989, the top 1% had 8.4 trillion worth of wealth in the economy of the US. Now they have 29.5 trillion worth of wealth. In 1989, the bottom 50% of Americans had $0.7 trillion compared to 8.4 trillion for the 1%, the two red blocks. In 2018, the top 1% now have 29 trillion, and 50% of Americans don't have any wealth at all. They're actually in debt. Net. And what are we talking about wealth? We're talking about houses, we're talking about stocks and shares, and obviously the 50% don't have any of those, but houses and so on. So there are more people with debt on their houses than they can actually cover the houses. That's their main property. They might have pensions as well, but when you add it all together and the liabilities they've got, they're actually in a negative territory. That's the situation that has developed over the last 30 years. And here's the US inequality of income. It's worse in the US, but it's pretty bad everywhere. You can see that we have what's called the Gini index, which is a measure of the average inequality in an economy. Back in the 1970s, just at the end of the golden age, it was about 39.39. Now it is 0.48. So that's a jump of something like 30% on income inequality in the US. So the rich are getting richer, they have more wealth, the poor are getting poorer, they have less wealth. The inequality of income, whether it's by work or by other income, is rising significantly. This level of inequality has not been seen for probably 150 years in the US. I just want to give the UK one. The inequality of wealth within the UK by region. in households. Where is all the wealth in the UK by households? Well, it's highly, obviously, in the southeast, high prices of property, housing and so on, also where people have the better paid jobs, and there's a lot of rich people also from other countries too coming in. But you can see that all the wealth in the UK is concentrated in the southeast. Well, you say, well, that's not particularly strange, but it is. The UK has the highest disparity between those who own wealth and those who don't by region in the whole of Europe. We are the most unequal bunch of households in Europe, by region at any rate. So the further north you go, the less you have. This is for me. If you're thinking about your retirement on a nice pension after this long expansion, forget it. Pensions and retirement savings are going to be way short of what people retiring, when they do retire, are going to need in order to do so. If you're at the savings gap, as it's called in the US, is dramatically higher it will be in 2050 when some of you will retire, than it was even in 2015. And the gaps you can see are generally rising across the world. So not only are we not earning much more money, not only is wealth unequal, not only is income unequal, but when you finish working, you'll be way short of what you need to have a decent life. You'll be driven back down as a result of the lack of retirement savings. Not for everybody, but on average, that's the position. And this is the last one, Chair. Most important of all, which we must never forget, there's a capitalist rapacious drive for profits and the exploitation, not just of people, but the planet itself, is creating conditions for another terminal crisis that capitalism cannot appear to be able to avoid, which will mean through the rise of global emissions and global warming, we'll enter a period where there'll be extreme weather, extreme floods and droughts across the world, temperatures all over the place, and in particular in the poorest parts of the world, the most severe disaster and catastrophe for hundreds of millions of people. And nothing is being done about this.
Yeah. Hello. I'm not an economist. I'm a social worker by trade, so I get the up and downs bits, but not a lot else. But what strikes me is there is a climate emergency. The government has declared it. And at the time when capitalism was gearing up for war, you've got spikes of, production was changed in order was completely re-geared towards war. And you had a spike in, anyway, it looks good on the graph. Bad for the rest of us and during the war, yeah. But in terms of economics, it looks good. So therefore, if a government or several governments decided we have got a climate emergency, we're going to behave like we've got one, we're going to re-gear our industry to deal with it, wouldn't we get a spike? And if not, why not?
Brilliant, thank you. If I could ask the microphone to pass to this comrade over here in the blue shirt.
Thank you for the talk, Michael. 2 questions. It was interesting because I saw an article in the Financial Times around 2 months ago about the yield curve and how it's predicted crisis. And it was basically saying what you said. There was a counter argument though, which was saying because this time around the dip into negative was so short and small, it might not be enough to actually trigger a recession. So I was wondering what you thought about that. And also, I think it was interesting, you didn't mention leverage, but, I'm sure you talk about it a lot, and this was, one of the major triggers of the financial crisis in 2008. So, yeah, maybe if you can speak a little bit about leverage at the moment, that would be cool as well. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you.
Hello. I actually didn't want to ask a question, just wanted to thank Michael for his work. I've been following him for years, and I really appreciate the work he does on the empirical analysis of capitalism. And I wanted to stress, and well, I guess that we all know it because we're here listening to him, but stress the importance of keeping in mind the laws of motion of capitalism, because I come from Spain, and maybe you are familiar with the downfall of the leftist parties that has been happening for the last few years. We had this great hope for Podemos to be able to change the political landscape in Spain. They were actually just proposing, and they were literally saying they were just proposing what social democrats in the 80s or the 70s were defending. In my opinion, they were forgetting about the laws of motion of capitalism, profitability as the leader of the guide of capitalism. And so now that they have been losing support in polls and they are really struggling, they even had a split with a party that's even a split led by Íñigo Errejón, which is trying to push the interpretations of Michael Henrich, which Michael Roberts has debated with. And I'm just very worried about what's happening in Spain, and I just wanted to tell people, to warn them not to forget about the empirical analysis that Michael and other people undertake, because they are very crucial not to lose mind that it is important to do discourse analysis, to be able to reach new people, to be able to better communicate our message, but not to forget the material or the economic analysis of the underlying laws of motion, and just that. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. If I could ask you just to pass this comrade in the red shirt, you might just be able to pass it to him. Yeah, thanks.
I'd like to thank Michael for that fantastic presentation. I don't have a question, but I'd like to thank the female comrade who put the first question to you. Please, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, back to the team member, please. If we could get this comrade here in the blue shirt, in the blue vest. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, again, thanks to Michael for a sort of heroic overview of what's going on in the world economy. I think that there's just one clarification that needs teasing out, that you looked at China and how important that's been in actually underpinning the world economy. And you talked about the fact that the trade war has obviously sort of meant a drop in trade and investment. But I think it's important to question perhaps a bit more deeply the role of China, because predating that, it's not just my view, but the view of, I think, most people, that China is not going to be able to continue that role, given that its own ruling class have acknowledged the sort of problems with the enormous growth rates and the enormous speculative problems that exist in China. So perhaps you could just pay some attention to that story as well.
Brilliant, thank you.
My question actually is about a thing I caught on BBC Two last week, Inside the Bank of England. I don't know if anyone saw it. It was a fascinating thing. Two reasons for this is that I never realised that they send out investigators every day to different parts of the UK to determine whether a slight increase in the interest rate will have an effect on investment and various other things. And it reminded me of in the Second World War, the mass observation that Churchill conducted in fear that morale in Britain would fall. And overall, what struck me, it's only the first programme, was they are shitting themselves. That's the only conclusion you can have from all these economists sat around watching graphs. They are not confident in their system at all. So that was the first thing about the programme. The second thing is they talk a lot about economic terms. The only thing they don't mention is inequality. And I just thought your presentation was brilliant because you dealt exactly with what they're dealing with, but at the end you mentioned the real economic indicator of a civilized society, and that's inequality. And I'd like to thank you for that. But also maybe somebody might come back about inside the Bank of England, what they thought of it. It's quite a simplistic thing, but I thought it was really good.
Brilliant, thank you. So next we have the comrade down here in the blue top.
Thank you. I think it's the best meeting at Marxism so far because it underpins everything we're talking about. My question is, having been really pleased to see Chris Williamson speaking last night at Marxism, and he talked about the lack of investment, how a future Labour government would use the Bank of England to print money to invest. How would you argue with him?
Brilliant, thank you. If we could get the... Sorry, you finished? Okay, brilliant. Is it comrade just there? Yeah, Ian, yeah. Sorry, blue top. He's got his hand up. Thanks.
Yeah, it's striking, looking at Michael's presentation and the figures and so on, how weak the global economy is, and particularly in the UK, the US, Europe, and so on. Given that the central banks have systematically flung everything they have to try and stimulate the economy for the last decade, with quantitative easing, so printing money that's gone into the stock market and all the rest of it, and the historically unprecedentedly low near to zero interest rates. And the central banks are basically agree with Michael. That's clear, because the European Central Bank has retreated on its plans to rein in quantitative easing and raise interest rates and so on. The Bank of England appears to be doing the same and issued a warning in the Bank of England governor in the last week, and the Federal Reserve is poised to do the same, encouraged by Trump. And the reason the stock market rose this week was that the new head of the European Central Bank was announced to be Christine Lagarde of the IMF, who is confidently seen to be going to continue the policies of quantitative easing, stimulating the stock market, all the rest of it. So it's quite possible, because the reason Michael's prediction of a recession has not come to fruition up to now is not because his predictions are wrong, looking at the underlying facts. It's that you can't predict the timing accurately because of all the other factors and what the central banks do and all the rest of it. So it's possible. The latest productivity figures for Britain are astonishing in the fact that there's yet another fall, and it'd be interesting to hear you say something more about that, because mainstream economists continue to scratch their heads about how can so much being invested in technology and so much technology be deployed and the rate of productivity just goes down. The Financial Times published a lovely graph showing the development of the iPhone and imports of the iPhone, and it exactly plots the rise of the iPhone with the decline in the rates of productivity. Just one final thing. Could you say anything about the limits of GDP as an indicator as a measure of economic activity? Because there's the old example, isn't there? If I dig a hole in the ground and fill it in myself, that doesn't go into GDP. But if you pay me to dig the hole and fill it in, then that would be measured as GDP, but it reflects nothing of value at all.
Thank you.
Thanks, good lecture. A couple of points. China, apparently 2012, used up more cement than the United States did in the whole of its history. Yep. God. Now. My friend sitting next to me asked about how they managed to get this in China, this substantial growth rate, 10% or something, for quite so long. My thought was, it's presumably the way in which they're squeezing the people that they're getting off the land and into the semi-industrial areas of Guangdong and the whole chunk of China that's to the north of Hong Kong, and presumably it's coming from their surplus value. Second point, Amazon, get on my holy hopscotch. They apparently have got 29,500 people employed in this country, and they're going for another 2,000. Amazon also have managed to pay exactly £62 million in corporation tax over 20 years. Isn't that good for somebody? On inequality, I like the thing recently by Shrubsole, where he's from, I'm not sure, Oxford, Cambridge, somewhere, who did an investigation into the distribution of land in this country and found that 50% of the land is owned by 1% of the population. Not bad, eh, for an overcrowded place. Thank you.
This will be the last contributor from the session, and then Michael will come back.
Just 2 points. First, following on from what Ian Taylor was saying, I think the perils of prediction are much greater in some senses, because one of the things the ruling class has been quite effective at is finding mechanisms to defer crisis through largely central bank intervention. And it creates all kinds of distortions. And this is tied in with politics as well. Why does Trump tweet out today, oh, it's going to be great when they cut interest rates in the Fed? Because they've just published a report saying the jobs market is more buoyant in America and the Fed's having second thoughts about cutting interest rates. And he's putting political pressure on to slash interest rates and prolong the boom in America. Very important to say that though they can defer the crisis, what they can't do is eradicate the tendency towards crisis. The price of doing this is to introduce new forms of financial instability and to allow the crisis tendencies to fester in the system. And at some point, yeah, there is going to be a recession, I think sooner rather than later, but they're going to enter that recession finding that they've shot a lot of the weapons they need to avert the next recession. It's going to be a very, very difficult and chaotic political event for them to try to manage it next time around, and we have to be ready for that. The second point I want to make is about China, because what China shows for me is another face of the development of crisis. If you look at the pattern of profitability in China, you see a much more classic, old-fashioned, sharp decline in profitability taking place as the rate of accumulation soars during the course of a Chinese boom, right up until the crisis when the export markets begin to dry up. What does the Chinese government do in response to that? It unleashes a massive wave of credit. In other words, the Chinese government does exactly what the US government did back in 2001. The Chinese state is increasingly integrated into the circuits of global capitalism as a capitalist power itself, and therefore it's subject to all the kind of problems that classically develop within a capitalist economy. The difference is that the crisis in the West takes the form of sluggish, slow, stagnant accumulation. The crisis in China takes a form of massive overaccumulation, to the extent that you have to invest, I think, twice as much capital now to get the same level of return in terms of profitability. China is not in the kind of deep crisis that the world was in 2008, 2009. But again, if you look at China, you see that way that these crisis tendencies develop over long periods of time. And I think we have to be very, very clear. The crisis of 2008, 2009 is not over. There was an astonishing piece, Michael mentioned it, that the recovery has been extraordinarily long. Not just the longest recovery in the US since 1945. I think the FT reported it was the longest recovery since 1860-something. The longest recovery in the US since records begun. The longest recovery, but what a miserable, weak, fragile, depressing recovery this is. And it's a damning indictment of the capitalist system that this is the best that we can get. And we should redouble our efforts, therefore, to say this is a rotten system. We have to go out and fight it.
That's Michael.
Well, comrades, most of you didn't ask enough questions. Climate change, China, recession, Bank of England, Chris Williamson's People's Money, productivity, what's the reason for the fall, what will happen is GDP a good way of measuring anything? So I'm going to start on all of those. Let me deal with the question of climate change, which is extremely important. I think the comrade who opened up the questioning has raised a very important point, that if the resources of the world, and for that matter, if the capitalists of the world decided to put their minds to solving the issue of climate change by introducing all the measures necessary to control renewals, to reduce the use of fossil fuels to the barest minimum through a process of transition of an economy which is planned and had the resources to back it, then we can crack this real danger to the planet. It requires the sort of thing, as she said, of a war economy, if you like, or a Marshall Plan, which happened in the post-war period, on an international scale, led by all the major governments with backing and support of the resources and investment and the involvement and participation of all the people for such a democratic plan for a green world, if you like, and the control of this real danger to the planet and its environment. Having said that, what are the chances of the existing bunch of capitalist governments and all their new leaders who are now taking over coming together to coordinate that? Well, at the moment, it doesn't look too good. They obviously do not consider that it is an issue as bad as solving the problems of Germany after the Second World War and so on. For them, it is still a battle between each other to get the biggest share of things, and if necessary, in the case of America and other countries, they will continue to use as much as possible their fossil fuel advantage where oil production has dramatically increased. So it remains a major question. I mean, we have a slogan over there saying system change, not climate change. In a way, I think I would pose it slightly differently and say system change is necessary in order to stop climate change, which is slightly different from the slogan, but that's the area in which we have to move, it seems to me, to solve this. Now, a technical question was raised about the yield curve. I won't bore you with this one, but the gist of it is that if the yield curve, which was negative, goes back positive, then there won't be a recession if it only happens quickly. And that seems to be the evidence. It's got to stay negative for some time before it becomes an indicator which looks reliable. Well, it's still staying negative. We'll see whether that works out in the near future. But one of the big questions raised was the question of China. And I think this is a whole subject on its own about the nature of why an economy, from the 1980s in particular, but even before that, could grow at the rate of between 8 to 10% a year and take 800 million people out of the official definition of poverty over 30 years and moved from a broadly rural peasant economy into the most increase in urbanisation in the history of any national economy in the space of 30 years and become a major manufacturing and trading power around the world, and now challenging the US on the new technologies with Huawei and the other things which the US is trying to block. How can that have happened? And I have to ask you this question, which I won't answer. How could that have happened in a capitalist economy? Something else, in my view, which is where I differ with a lot of other Marxist economists, is going on in China, which is a bit different than the traditional capitalist development that we've seen over the last 30 years, because there hasn't been much capitalist development over the last 30 years. Here's a country that stands out. You strip out China from the growth figures, from the inequality figures, and you'll see a dramatic difference for the rest of the countries. It stands out. It's something that everybody in this room should consider very carefully, and whether that means that it is now going to go into a credit boom-fueled bust like the rest of the West did in 2009 and maybe will again, I think is still an open question. I don't see that likely to happen. So in this area, it remains a very interesting development on the world scale that we need to analyse. I'll just add one section of that. China is not a socialist country. China is not a democratic country. China is not workers' democracy. China is an autocratic dictatorship through a one-party system, which the leaders of which are nicely taking the money into their pockets with their sons and daughters on billionaires. But is it an open capitalist market economy which drives forward on the basis of profitability, or does the state direct and control and drive that economy? All I would say is that sometimes rich billionaires in China are asked to disappear for a few weeks if they've stepped out of line, and maybe they don't come back unless they carry out the policies of the state. So we want a Marshall Plan on climate change. China seems to be in a better position to impose it as they feel. Otherwise, the people who are opposed to that may find that they will be facing a firing squad. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't seem to be the solution for the world socialism, but it appears to be something of an interesting development in the case of this particular economy. Some people say, another technical question, GDP. GDP doesn't cover welfare, it doesn't cover the environmental costs, it doesn't cover lots of things outside of production and investment and so on. Yes, it doesn't. That measure is a measure for the capitalists. It's not a measure for the welfare of people. However, as we're in a capitalist economy, I like to use the measure because it tells me, it gives me some guide to whether capitalism is doing well. But it's not a measure of welfare for the people. We need a different welfare measure. There have been attempts to do that, but only to a limited extent. So when people say to me, GDP is a useless measure, it's a useless measure for us in some ways, but it's not a useless measure for the capitalists. This is why they use it. That's why surveys by the Bank of England to find out whether people like interest rates where they are at the moment is something they need to know. They're always building up data to understand what's the best way to develop the capitalist economy. People's money. Well, Chris Williamson and others who support the idea of what is called modern monetary theory, or another version is people's money, quantitative easing, is to say, look, we don't need the banks to lend the money, and we don't need, the governments can print as much money as they like and either give it directly to people or directly to companies, do away with the banks, and that will be okay because governments can't go bust. And this is the way forward to change our economy. Well, all I would say to that is two things. One, when the money goes to the companies, or it goes to the people who are supposed to be making these investments, what guarantee is there that these big companies are going to invest in productive activity? Well, we'll make them do that. Okay, well, how are you going to make them invest in... We're going to tell there's guidelines so they have to use this money to invest. Why are we going around all this regulation and guidelines? I hear this argument. I've been to so many labour movements, I'm now going to get angry. I've been to so many labour movement meetings where I sit with an audience, with other speakers, progressive economists, Momentum and elsewhere, and say, we need to regulate the banks. We need to break the banks up. We need to have a new post office bank. We need to organise the banking in the interest of the people. Right? So, well, take the buggers over there. Oh, no. We're going to renationalise the railways. We're going to take over the energy companies. We're going to take over the water monopolies. We're going to do this. But we're not going to touch the big five. They're going to stay there. And if we're not going to lend them any more money then, we're going to print our own money and run it directly to the people. Why are we going around the houses? Let's get control of the commanding heights of the economy and the finance houses under democratic ownership. Then we can plan things. And then we can organise things for climate change and the other things that the peoples need in this country and others.